Well, hello, an extremely warm welcome to my channel. A very warm welcome if you are a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you are joining me for my musings, ramblings, wafflings, whatever you might want to call them, for the very, very first time. So I would describe November as a very mixed reading month for me this year. I read some belters, but I also read some books that maybe, I don't know, I didn't quite gel or didn't quite work for me for the mood I was in at this time of year. I'm not sure. So right back at the beginning of the month, I read The Wood at Midwinter, I can't even say it, by Susanna Clarke. And I think this is an absolutely beautiful little novel. It's a perfect Christmas present, isn't it? I mean, just look at the jazzily nature of that cover. It just looks, it sort of smacks of luxury. Then you've got the wonderful front pieces, which, you know, are decorated with holly, and then the superb illustrations inside as well. I'm trying to remember the name of the illustrator. Oh my goodness. You see, they should make it easy, shouldn't they? And it's probably just me. Illustrations by Victoria Sorden. But I had to really look, tiny writing on the back, and yet, you know, the illustrations are as important, I think, in this book as the words are. And this story I thought was quite unusual. On the surface of it, it's very light. It's the story of two sisters set in a time that feels like, you know, the Victorian era, and they're travelling by carriage into the woods. And one sister is obviously helping the other sister achieve some sort of, you know, dream. And Meredith is the main character. She wants to go into the woods. She can talk to the animals. There's obviously something very, very different about her. And she then wants to kind of completely sort of subvert the mores of the time, because she wants to, well, no, I'm not going to say actually, because it's a bit of a spoiler. But I thought, gosh, you know, when I first read it, I thought, oh, there wasn't a lot to that story. But then it really, really made me think. And there's a fantastic postscript at the back by Susanna Clarke, where she starts to talk about her thoughts about sainthood and also about neurodivergence. And then the story, you're like, oh yeah, it takes on a completely different meaning. And actually, this is very much about a young woman who is completely clear in her own mind what she wants. She knows what she wants. She knows what will make her happy. She knows what makes her tick. But society doesn't get her at all. So I would really recommend this. I know some people have felt that maybe have been a bit cynical about it, the timing with Christmas and the beauty of it, but I don't have an issue with that. I think this is a wonderful wintry. I think some books are meant to be read at this time of year, and some books are designed to be gifted in this way. So yeah, I really, the story has stayed with me, and the descriptions of the snow and the woods and the silence and the stillness and the magic have remained in my consciousness. So there we go. The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. And then I read The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, and this was selected by Susanna Clarke for our interview with her. So Simon Savage and I interviewed Susanna Clarke for the wonderful Women's Prize Book Club. I think that you can still watch that video online. If you go to the Women's Prize website, there's a link if you're interested in watching it. But Susanna Clarke chose a book from the Women's Prize backlist that she wanted to talk about it, and it was The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. And I am so grateful to her for choosing that. She was quite apologetic because she said she hadn't realised what a thick book it was, and obviously, you know, we had quite a big, or I did, I hadn't read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell before, so her book. So, you know, we had quite a hefty reading diet that month. But nevertheless, I was really grateful that she chose this, because and I know this is controversial, but I wasn't a massive fan of The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which of course was a blockbuster. I don't know how long ago. Is it 10 years ago, 20 years ago? It seems like a long time ago. I really enjoyed the opening, and then I felt it, and I knew it was about the classical world and blah, 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 and it really disappointed. And I think partly because I'm not a fan of novels set in schools or on campuses. I have a bit of a problem with that. But anyway, so I think that might just be a personal thing. I thought this novel was wonderful. I read it very quickly, considering that it is a tome. I absolutely love. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it before, which is always an important yardstick. And it tells the story of Theo, whose mother dies right at the Donna Tartt brilliantly builds this relationship between Theo and his mother at the beginning of the story, and they're very close. The father is absent. He's had problems with drink. He's had problems with money, gambling, that kind of thing. And yet, you know, he is still Theo's father, but he's been very absent from his life for some time. So Theo and his mother have this very close bond, and right at the beginning of the novel, they go to an art gallery, and the reason that they're in that art gallery is because Theo has been in trouble at school, and they're going to a meeting at the school to discuss his future because he's been suspended. And they're a bit early, so they go into the gallery to pass time. So it's kind of, you can see how in Theo's mind, it's kind of his fault that they're in the art gallery in the first place. And then there's this explosion that happens, and the description of the explosion I will never ever forget. She writes it as if it's happening to you in real time, and he's telling the story. So, you know, it really, I still am trapped under that rubble with him. I'm still, my ears are doing what his ears were doing. It is the most fantastic, I felt, account of that kind of really traumatic event and the disorientation of it. Anyway, when he's in the art gallery, he's not alone. There is a man, an older man, an elderly man, who is dying, and Theo talks to him and kind of comforts him as he's dying. And this old guy, in his dying moments, he makes a real impact on Theo, and Theo decides to take the painting, the Goldfinch, which was just happened to be in this room, the painting on the front by Fabricius. He decides to take it, to protect it, puts it in a bag, takes it out as he leaves, as he manages to leave the art gallery. And in his own mind at the time, he is just keeping this picture safe. So the dying man was also with with a young girl, a young red-headed girl, who Theo sort of kind of becomes obsessed with. Anyway, the story picks up and it goes off in all sorts of different directions. The main sort of issue of the story, I suppose, or the point for discussion, is the fact that Theo is kind of abandoned by society. He obviously doesn't want to go into care, so he says to social services that he wants to go to stay with this family of a boy called, I think he's called Andy, who they're extremely wealthy family, and he was very close friends with Andy when he was younger, but they don't really know each other anymore. It's been years since they've been friends, and Theo, kind of in desperation, asks if he can go there for the first night and ends up staying. But what he also does is he makes contact. So the dying man in the art gallery gives him a ring, and he knows where the owner of this ring, well, he doesn't know where the owner of this ring is, but he knows this ring is connected with a particular address, and it's the address of a furniture restorer and antique seller. And Theo goes and knocks on his door and establishes a relationship with him as well, which I found very moving and very generous hearted. There are lots of really unusual characters in this novel, one of whom is Theo's friend Boris. And again, I'm not going to say much more because I don't want to spoil the events of the novel if you haven't read it. But he ends up at one point in his life living in very difficult circumstances, and he makes friends with this guy called Boris, who's sort of Russian and sort of Ukrainian, a bit of this, that, and the other. And Boris is quite a what's the word? Anarchic character, and has some very sort of mixed morals and views on society. But their friendship is so brilliantly described and plausible, even though they come from incredibly different backgrounds. And I love the thread of that relationship as it unwinds through the novel as well. There are lots of twists and turns, and I felt like this is one of the few novels that I've read where I felt the resolution was absolutely, for me, spot on. So this was a world that I was very, very happy to get lost in. It's got elements of sort of thriller about it because the painting and its whereabouts become really problematic. And of course, it's worth an awful lot of money. So Theo, there's a lot of jeopardy in the book, and Theo finds himself in so many different situations, and and he sort of relates everything with a real freshness and a real honesty. I loved his voice. So yeah, absolutely loads to commend about this. And I like the way that Donna Tartt is unflinching about representing some really sort of quite underworld characters, but shows them in a really rounded way. She's not judgy, which I really valued. And I also think this book has got an awful lot to say about love and about what happens to a child when they're left without their parent, you know, in their adolescence, which again maybe is something that it is written about, but I think this was written about with a lot of honesty. So there we go. Really enjoyed that. And then I read, and I know I've already talked about this on an earlier video to do with non-fiction, because it was non-fiction November. So I thought, well, I better read some non-fiction. And I've had Bernardine Evaristo's Manifesto on my shelves for some time, saving it as a treat. And it was a real treat to read. It's a fantastic insight into the sheer effort and determination that takes a young woman from a very large family living in pretty impoverished circumstances in London, and taking her 60 years ago and taking her from a point where she can become a Booker Prize winning novelist. And if for any aspiring writer, I think it should serve as tremendous inspiration. But I also think for anyone who needs some lessons or some wisdom about resilience, the way that Bernadine bounces back from so many different situations where she could have just given up and stopped writing, and yet she doesn't. And her description of her childhood I really enjoyed, of how she was sort of, you know, very individual and very quite stubborn and determined from a young age, and she sort of tries to unpick why that is. I enjoyed learning about her career in drama. I enjoyed learning about her sexuality and how that sort of played into her views on life and on contemporary society, and of course writing about her being black as well, being a black British woman. I think, you know, she does that really well, and I just found it very, very inspiring. And the way that she writes about the art of writing and the way that she approaches it, I mean, she's not suggesting that this is the way that one should go about writing, and the way that she's very honest about how solitary and how isolating a writing career can be. So yeah, a lot to like in this, and very, very sort of simply and clearly written. Now, for months and months and months, I always have a poetry collection on the go, and I realise I don't really talk about poetry very much. Don't know why, but I don't tend to include it in my wrap-ups. I thought I would. And this is the complete collected poems of Maya Angelou. Now, I have read quite a few of her poetry collections, but this one, I don't know, it's a hardback I picked up in a charity shop some time ago, and there's just something lovely and solid about it. And a lot of these poems I'd already read before and knew, but many of them were poems that I came to for the first time. And Maya Angelou, for me, I mean, she's a civil rights campaigner. She was a writer, a dancer, a singer. I mean, her career was just phenomenal. And, her life story, her autobiographical novels, which start with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, had a profound effect on me when I was reading them in my early 20s. Probably one of the first books that I read written by anybody who was Black, I think. So she, and whenever if I'm ever feeling a bit, I love watching videos of her talking about anything, usually about race, but often gender too. And because she just seems to me to be a woman who was incredibly wise. And one of the things I love about this collection is that it is full of wisdom. And there was a poem in here. Every time I read a collection like this, there'll be poems that crop up that really, really resonate. And this one, I hope I can find it. I was going to read it to you because I don't remember reading this poem before. And it, I don't know, I think maybe because I haven't, since George Floyd and all of that business, you reappraise and you reappraise and you reappraise. And I just thought this was such a fair take on the difference between being a white woman and being a Black woman, and how acceptance is really hard for the Black community to accept a sort of non-racist stance easily. The awkwardness of it and the difficulty of it, and oh well, we're really sorry. And from the white perspective, how difficult it must be for Black people to accept that apologetic stance. And it's a poem called Family Affairs. So I hope you will excuse me because I really do want to share it. Family Affairs. You let down from arched windows, over hand-cut stones of your cathedrals, seas of golden hair, while I, pulled by dusty braids, left furrows in the sands of African beaches. Princes and commoners climbed over waves to reach your vaulted boudoirs, as the sun capriciously struck silver fire from waiting chains where I was bound. My screams never reached the rare tower where you lay, birthing masters for my sons and for my daughters, a swarm of unclean badgers to consume their history. Tired now of pedestal existence for fear of flying and vertigo, you descend and step lightly over my centuries of horror and take my hand, smiling. Call me sister. Sister, accept that I must wait a while. Allow an age of dust to fill ruts left on my beach in Africa. Oh my goodness. That poem, I've read it over and over and over again in the last few weeks since I first encountered it. And every time, like any good piece of writing, every time I read it, I see something different in it. And it's just, I just think, well, I'm not going to say anymore. I just thought that was amazing. Blew my mind. And then I read Luckenbooth by Jenni Fagan. And I think I've got a really mixed relationship with this book. I said it had been a mixed reading month. And this book is one of the reasons, because there was so much about it that I loved and wanted to commend. But there were also, I had issues with it as well. So it starts off it's set in Edinburgh mainly, and it starts off with this young girl called, I think she's called Rosie McCrae, and she is floating or about to float off in a coffin as her means of transport from some island further north up the coast of Scotland. And she appears to have murdered her father, and he has sent her to father a child with a well-to-do man who is the owner of Luckenbooth, number 10 Luckenbooth, which is a tenement block in Edinburgh, and not too far from the castle. So it's right in the centre of Edinburgh. And so there is a real gothic, dark, oozing quality to this novel, and it is beautifully written. The writing is extraordinarily good, I think. But it's also, it's one of these books that spans different moments in time, and you encounter lots and lots of different characters, many of whom you return to, but not all, I don't think. And there is an awful lot of violence and quite brutal sex in this novel. And I found myself struggling with that. I felt it was, to me, it was just almost unrelentingly bleak. And I found that difficult. And it's a really uncomfortable read. And maybe this is its strength, I don't know, because all the characters in it are misfits in some way. There is not a single character in here who is kind of conventional. And it might be for reasons of their social position, it might be through reasons of sexuality or gender or whatever, or poverty. But every single character has some sort of quirk or whatever. And I almost had too much of it. It just felt to me like, it was sort of too rich in that way, to the point where I was kind of, a new character would come in at a different time. So all these characters at some point are connected with 10 Luckenbooth. And something terrible happens to Rosie, and it's almost as if she is kind of haunting the building. And I did like that sense of menace, but I just found it overwhelming to read. And maybe it's reading it in a darker month as the nights are drawing in. Possibly that was one of the issues for me. I don't know, but it left me, I couldn't wait to finish it. I couldn't leave it unfinished, but I wanted to finish it and put it to one side because I kind of felt like I was being battered from all directions. And the saving grace was that there's this wonderful character called Ivor who emerges towards the end of the book, who was a miner, and he develops this and it's the 80s, it's Thatcher in the UK. She was the Prime Minister who took on the miners, and they decided to go on strike, and she dealt with it, from my perspective, in a very sort of brutal way. And the saving grace for me was this character of Ivor, who is actually a scab. He won't go on strike. He keeps returning to the pit, and he doesn't really understand himself why, but it's actually because he's got this phobia of light, and actually the mines are the only safe spaces that he feels he can be in. So I found that really interesting. And the other thing that I really, really commend Jenni Fagan for is her unflinching attack on capitalist politics. I really relished that as I read it. So lots of things. You can see this book is going to stay with me, but it's making me kind of tense just thinking about it. I found it a very difficult read. And then I read, and this was my book of the month this month, I read Lifting the Lid on a Baby Boomer's Memory Box, One Boy's Life and Times. And this is actually a book that was written by my brother-in-law, Bob Perry. And I just feel so lucky to have this beautifully written history of my husband's family. It's a memoir. It charts the first 10 years of Bob's life. And he described himself as an unremarkable boy living in remarkable times. And I just love the way that he conveys the history of the 60s, and he explains lots of different historical events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, really, really well, really clearly. But also just the day-to-day life of very ordinary working class people, struggling to make ends meet, and going on holiday and going to the football matches and all those wonderful sort of working class attitudes to life. I really, really enjoyed it. Very personal to me, that one. And then I think one of the highlights of my reading month was reading Saltwater by Jessica Andrews. I thought this was a wonderful novel, and I read this I'm behind with my Savage prompts this year. So these are the prompts that Simon and I do each year, where readers suggest prompts and we pick them out of not a hat, a jar usually. And I think this was October's prompt, so I'm behind, but it was to read a book that was set in a part of the world that you've lived for more than a year. So this book is set in Sunderland, which is very near to Newcastle, where I lived for 4 years of my life, and very, very fond memories of that place. And Jessica Andrews is giving voice to, again, the working class experience. And her lead character, I think, is called Lucy. And Lucy is telling the story, and she is really disorientated. She's spending time in Ireland following the death of her grandfather, who was Irish. And she's spending time in the house. She and her mother have like burnt everything. There's very little in the house. And Lucy is obviously having some sort of meltdown. And during her stay in the house, she kind of deconstructs her own life. And we are told that in these kind of fragmentary recollections. And Lucy has managed to escape, is perhaps not the right word, but that's how society sees it, I think. She's managed to escape from a very grey, concrete upbringing, and an upbringing where, the members of her family were not educated particularly. Her father had terrible struggle with alcoholism. I mean, the way that's charted in this book I thought was really interesting, and again, very, very brutally honest and realistic about the implications of an alcoholic father on his partner, on the two children. So Lucy has a younger brother as well. I really enjoyed that. But the most important thing behind this novel is exploring the relationship between mother and daughter. And Lucy she's envisaging herself inside her mother's womb, and it's almost like she's sort of given birth and then grows up. During the course of the novel, we go right back to her early childhood, and she's trying to make sense of her relationship with her mother, but more particularly is trying to give herself permission not to be like her mother. She really admires her mother and she loves her, but she also, through the course of the novel, realizes that there are certain decisions and certain choices that her mother made in her life that Lucy wants to give herself the freedom not to replicate. And again, I don't think I've really read a novel that focused on that concept. And actually, I think it's so important that we can grow up and be our own selves and not, I mean, I'm really guilty of this. My daughter looks very, very like me, and she has made certain decisions in her life that have been very similar to mine. And sometimes I make the mistake that she would think like me and make other decisions that I would. And she doesn't, because of course she's not me. She's her own person. And I hate the idea that she might ever sort of want to not feel that she can be her own self. So maybe this was a bit close to the bone as well in some ways, this novel. Beautifully written, absolutely loved it. And I keep meaning to check, I don't know whether this was a debut. I'm not sure whether Jessica Andrews has written anything since. I suspect she has, and I need to go out and find it and read it, because I really, really enjoyed it. And then finally, again, I've been reading this for a while. I quite often do that with poetry and short story collections. So this is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. Oh my goodness. I think this has to be the weirdest collection of short stories that I have ever read. And part of me loved it, and part of me hated it, and part of me struggled with it, and part of me flew through it. But I think that's often the way with short story collections. There are some really, really memorable stories in here. There's a fantastic story about a woman who decides to go through a sort of bariatric surgery procedure that both her sisters, I think it's two earlier sisters, have been through. And it really looks at, you know, the image of the female body, and it's deeply, deeply unsettling. There's another fantastic story about a woman who's working in a sort of bridal shop where they're selling all these amazing kind of ball dresses, and there are also these women who are disappearing, like literally, and they're being stitched into these dresses, and just the most weird and wacky. I think this book is a real expression of what the feat of the human imagination can do, and then put onto paper, and then make plausible. I'm not sure how I feel about it, though. There were also lots of stories in here that just made me shudder. I think there are similarities between my reaction to this and my reaction to Luckenbooth. Sometimes there was just a bit too much violence, or a bit too much discomfort, or a bit too much sex. And I think that might just be my, you know, my personal taste. I don't know. Sometimes I felt a bit, I felt almost alienated from the stories, and I don't think that's a fault of a writer. I think that might just be me struggling to understand. So yeah, I think it's a really contemporary, really exciting, really in many ways monstrous collection of stories that certainly made me think, and certainly made me feel uncomfortable. But I can't say it was an enjoyable read. That's where I'm going to leave it. So yeah, lots of sort of pluses and pros and cons there, I think, in my reading experience for November. But anyway, please let me know what you've got up to in your November reading. As always, I love to hear where you're at with your books, and let's hope that December. I am currently reading Rose Tremaine's Lily, which I'm really enjoying, and I can't wait to, A, I'm going to curl up and finish that in a minute, and B, I can't wait to talk to you about that in December, because it's a very, well, it is actually the 1st of December today, but it's a very, to me, it is the sort of story that I love reading around Christmas time. Anyway, take care, everybody. I'm going to shut up and finish my coffee. And speak to you all soon. Happy reading.